There's a few rules you've got to follow if you want to speak at TED. You've got to stick to the time limit. Famously, this has often been 18 minutes, increasingly becoming more 15, 12 minutes. You aren't allowed to leave that big red circle. And you're also not allowed to pitch or sell. How is it then that Bryan Stevenson managed to raise over $1 million directly through this TED Talk we're going to look at today? Certainly at one point in time, and it may still be the case, this speech received the longest standing ovation in TED history. And those attendees who were standing up to applaud were those attendees who contributed towards that $1 million in donation. And if we break those numbers down a little bit further, that works out as $55,555 for every minute of Bryan's 18-minute TED Talk. Or if you want to break it down into the words, Bryan said 4,057 words in this presentation. That breaks down to $246 per word. That's pretty cool, right? Can you imagine saying a word, and magically $200+ appear? How did Bryan do it? Well, it might surprise you to learn that he never mentions the name of his nonprofit at all in his TED Talk. And 65% of this talk is centered around telling stories. This speech, I think, more than any other TED Talk, demonstrates the power of storytelling, because we see the power of storytelling play out in that cold, hard, objective data. The power of Bryan's stories directly related to money he was able to raise for his cause. And that's why this is a TED Talk that I use a lot as a case study and a demonstration when people are worried about the data and statistics that they need to put into their speeches. I say, no, the data and statistics feed in to an overall story that you're telling. You don't try to squeeze in some stories around the statistics. You start with the essence of the story first. And that's what Bryan does expertly in this TED Talk. And that's what we're going to break down in this analysis video today. Before we jump into that, my usual legal disclaimers. I am using the footage provided by TED. I do not claim ownership of the footage, and the use of this footage is for informational and educational purposes only. And there is certainly so much we can learn from this talk from Bryan Stevenson. Let's talk about an injustice.
She'd say, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And if I said no, she'd assault me again. And if I'd say yes, she'd leave me alone. And then she just...
I love that little smile that Bryan has there. It's this warm, friendly, relatable smile. It's something that he comes up with a couple of times. And something that I speak a lot with about my clients when we're talking about body language and expressions, I often say to them, it's the subtle stuff that gets the big results. Bryan doesn't have this big, huge body language at that point. But when he smiles, talking about, this case, it's a memory of his grandmother. When he's smiling, talking about his grandmother, you really feel that warmth and connection that he has with her that comes through that nice big smile. Smiles, they're a really underrated part of what makes you a successful speaker. When you're able to smile at your audience and they connect with that smile. Smiles make people feel good. You cannot smile enough in your speeches at appropriate points. Don't smile when you're talking about something serious or dark, but the rest of your speech, have as many smiles as you like.
The third thing I want you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol.
Did you catch that? There's another little bit of body language here. Do you see Bryan does this tiny swallow, this swallow of tension of, again, it's a small thing, but it really adds to that moment, doesn't it? His body language is fairly understated here. It's not unexpressive, but it's not big and large and boisterous, is it? So again, I think this is a really nice example of how the subtleties of body language and expression really bring out the detail and really bring out the emotion in your speaking.
My brother started staring at me. He said, what's wrong with you? Have some beer. Then he looked at me real hard. He said, oh, I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you. I said, well, what are you talking about? He says, well, Mama tells all the grandkids that they're special.
I love this moment. It's understated humor. Bryan delivers this joke as a 1-2 hit. So the first thing that we get is, I hope you're not hung up about what Mama said to you. And he doesn't make a big deal of this. He just has that moment, we're almost there with his siblings, and just that sort of bit of amusement of, oh, you're not still hung up about that. And it's this subtle humor, and that's what warms up the audience. Then he delivers the follow-up of, oh, she tells all the grandchildren that, and you see there's that bigger laugh. And you see at this moment that Bryan stops and he allows that laugh to ripple because he knows he's set it up the way he wanted to. He has the small warm-up line, the little bit of the plot twist, and then he has the larger punchline, the bigger plot twist. So he deliberately not understates the first one, but doesn't try to overemphasize that, because if he hits the audience too hard with that one, he doesn't build into the crescendo of the next punchline. This is a key part of humor, and we've talked about this, especially if you think back to the Ken Robinson TEDx analysis that I've done. If you haven't seen that, you can go and look on this playlist, the TEDx analysis playlist. It's the first one that I did. He uses a lot of humor, but the way he uses his humor is he layers the humor. He understands how to build the momentum of humor. Humor isn't just a one-punch punchline. Punchlines are actually a build-up process. And Bryan understands that with this. He's not doing the same type of rip-roaring comedy that Ken Robinson does, but he understands how to utilize the comedy that is available in his speech. Really nice execution and the building of the humor to reach the punchline and then ultimately the message of this anecdote.
And I'm going to admit to you that I've never had a drop of alcohol. I don't say that because I think that's...
All rules are made to be broken. There's always a way that you can find an exception to the rule in the right context. Now, if you've watched a lot of my speech analysis videos, thinking in particular of my US presidential videos, one of the things that I critiqued quite a few times and quite a few presidents on was they didn't understand the value of allowing the audience to respond with applause breaks, with cheers, on rare occasions laughter as well. So the general rule is don't stamp on your audience's reaction. If they laugh, let them laugh. If they clap, let them clap. If they cheer, let them cheer. However, here, Bryan does stamp on that applause break. And I actually think this is the correct thing to do in this instance. This is the breaking of the rule. When he says, I haven't touched a drop of alcohol, he doesn't want that statement to be self-serving. He's using that statement to demonstrate a point about the importance of identity and the way we see ourselves. When the audience start clapping, he doesn't want their attention to be focused on his personal achievement. He doesn't want the audience thinking, oh, that's so good for Bryan. He wants the audience focused on the importance of the message. And they won't focus on the importance of the message if they're busy clapping him for not drinking. So this is a really key understanding of when you can break the rules. I love seeing speakers break the rules, but you have to, if you're going to break the rules, you've got to get a better result than if you hadn't broken the rules at all. If you break the rules just through being sloppy, or you break the rules because you don't understand why the rule is good in the first place. If you go, right, I'm just going to come up on the stage and I'm going to have no body language because David told me to break the rules. I'm going to come up on stage and I'm going to speak in monotone because that breaks the rules. It's not breaking the rules for breaking the rules' sake. Rules are there for a reason. However, rules are not an ultimate truth. And if you can find the context and if you can find the appropriate place to break the rules, I love seeing someone who can break the rules effectively, and Bryan does that with this part of the speech.
Virtuous. I say that because there is power in identity. When we create the right kind of identity, we can say things to the world around us that they don't actually believe make sense. We can get them to...
Here we are. We're at 5 minutes 30 in Bryan's speech. And this is the first time that he's actually had some kind of lesson or message to the audience. Everything up until this point, he has been building a story. He talks about this relationship with his grandmother. He talks about this experience with his siblings, about not drinking. And then he shares with the audience, I haven't drunk a drop of alcohol. Everything has built up to encapsulate and hammer home this key message of the way that we see ourselves. And this is what great TED speeches do. Great TED speeches don't have a mile a minute. Every single minute it's, here's something that you should do. This is a lesson that you should learn. The great TED Talks, they know they've got a short amount of time. They've only got time for a couple of key messages to sink in. And those key messages need to link in to one overall mission and vision for the speech. Bryan has spent 5 minutes, a third of his speech, building up to one takeaway lesson. And this is where he delivers the lesson. He's built rapport and relatability with the audience. He's got them laughing. He's got them connecting with a story. He even had an applause break at one point. They were clapping and cheering his achievements. And when he has built up that rapport, built up that relationship, built up that engagement, that's when he hits the message home. Remember I said at the intro to this video that this TED Talk is 65% story? This is why you're seeing this come into play. He's using the story to build into these lessons. And it's those power of stories that allow those lessons to hit home. And that's why people got out their checks, they got out their bank cards, and they made those donations at the end of this talk. Because Bryan understood how much more powerful a lesson is when it's delivered through a story.
Well, I've been trying to say something about our criminal justice system. This country...
5:45. I've been trying to say something about this criminal justice system. Again, Bryan Stevenson, he's a human rights lawyer. His talk today is centered around teaching people about the criminal justice system, primarily in the US, and talking about the flaws, injustices that exist in this justice system. Why has he not mentioned it for the first third of his speech? Hasn't talked about it at all. We've heard this story about his grandmother, about him not drinking. Again, because Bryan realizes that you've got to build a relationship with the audience before they are ready to hear your message. And that's why he's devoted a huge chunk of his speech. He's only got 80 minutes. He doesn't have a lot of time. He's devoted a huge chunk of it just to building that rapport and relatability, because then he knows if the audience like him and trust him, they are going to be more receptive and open to what he has to say about the criminal justice system. Rather than coming on in the first minute and speaking off a pedestal, looking like he's preaching to the audience, he understands, no, you can't just launch into this. You've got to build into this.
This country is very different today than it was 40 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 7 million people on probation and parole, and mass incarceration, in my judgment, has fundamentally changed.
Again, this is the first time that we are hearing statistics in this speech. And by the way, I love that Bryan knows these statistics. No slides. He isn't pointing to the death by PowerPoint. Here's the table, here's the chart, here's the data, here's the statistics. So number one, he's not doing this through slides. Not that it's bad to do these things through slides. It can just be overdone through slides. But he didn't start his speech saying, we've got this terrible problem, listen to these statistics. Bryan understands that you connect with people emotionally first, and then they will be more open to hearing about the rational stuff, the data, the logic, the statistics. You don't persuade people through the data. People use data to justify emotional decisions they've already made. Most of us think it's the other way around. Most of us think that we are persuaded through the data, And that then leads to an emotional decision. Bryan knows it works the other way around. So that's why we are now a third of the way through the speech, and it's only now that we hear our first bit of data and statistics. So it's not that data and statistics are bad, it's not that they can't be used, and not that they aren't an important part of framing and understanding a problem, but that isn't the starting point. That isn't where you should go first. Go to the emotion first, and then the data follows.
In poor communities and communities of color, there is this despair, there is this hopelessness that is being shaped by these outcomes. 1 out of 3 black men between the ages of 18 and 30 is in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole.
We've got a linking up of techniques there. We've got a rule of 3 things, and we've also got the alliteration as well. We've got the prison, probation, parole. I love seeing when techniques are used synergistically. One technique has a good outcome. If you're able to combine techniques, it has an even stronger outcome. And when you hear that statistic, the statistic really gets hammered home through the use of those techniques. You go, wait, 1 in 3 is in one of those 3 situations? 1 in 3, that's you're sitting in the auditorium, look at the person on your left, look at the person on your right. One of you is in prison, probation, or parole, looking at the statistics in that way. That is the power of a technique. We talk about techniques all the time in public speaking, and certainly here on these analysis videos that I do. What it's really about is understanding when to employ these techniques, when those techniques are going to have the maximal effect, what are the key bits of information that you want to stand out, and when you identify they're the key things you want to stand out, what is a technique that adds that flourish and brings it to life? And that's what we see at this point here, the merging of techniques to make this shocking statistic really stand out.
Seem to be distorting around race. They're also distorted by poverty. We have a system of justice in this country that treats you much better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability.
What a great contrast that is. Rich and guilty, poor and innocent. You're seeing the employing of 2 opposites here. So Bryan doesn't just say you get treated better if you're rich compared to if you're poor. You get treated better if you are rich and guilty. So he weights this negative association of guilty with this positive association of innocent. So we go, well, of course we want to treat innocent people better than guilty people, right? But what he demonstrates is that's not the case. We don't treat people based on whether they are innocent or guilty. We're treating them based on whether they are rich or poor. So again, it's this really enlightening contrast, and it's this really clever playing of opposites that Bryan pairs 2 opposites here, not just one set of opposites to contrast, but he pairs, you can almost imagine there's kind of this 2x2 box, this cross thing going on where he's saying, actually, it's better to be rich than innocent. And is that the type of world we want to live in? Really powerful contrast presenting that picture here.
I think in another 10 years, the level of disenfranchisement will be as high as it's been since prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and there is this stunning silence. I represent children.
Nice. Stunning silence. And then he pauses afterwards. This is where you start to see a matching of the words that you say as a speaker with how you deliver them. Bryan could say, we have this disenfranchisement and there's a stunning silence about it, we're not doing anything about it. But he decides to embody what he's saying. There is this stunning silence. And you do almost hear that pin drop in that little bit of silence that he inserts in. Think about this in your speeches. Think about it's not just the words that you say, but it's how you embody the essence and the meaning behind these words. When you talk about a stunning silence, demonstrate what that stunning silence sounds like.
The question is, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? And that's a very sensible question. But there's another way of thinking about where we are in our identity. The other way of thinking about it is not do people deserve to die for the crimes they commit, but do we deserve to kill? It's fascinating.
Again, getting this flipping of perspective, reframing the question. This is what great speakers do. Great speakers are able to reframe the way we look at problems in society. What Bryan is doing here is he is taking this problem of punishment. How do we punish and how do we seek justice through that punishment? And we've got this question of, should we use death as a punishment? Is that an appropriate way to seek justice? Now he can attack this and say, well, actually, here's why I think death isn't an appropriate punishment, or here's why I think death is appropriate. He can fight on the pre-existing battlefield. But what great speakers are able to do is they're able to move an argument to a new plane. They're able to move it to a different dimension. And that's what Bryan does here for the reframing of, let's not think about the person who is being sentenced, but let's think about those who are doing the sentencing. And is it the right thing for them to be sentencing people to death? Is it the right thing for them? Ultimately, someone's got to kill that person. Is that the right way to seek justice? Bryan is moving this argument into a different plane, and great leaders are able to inspire this different way of thinking, because with that different way of thinking, we are then able to look at what are some of the different actions and processes that we can take as a result.
A kind of astonishing error rate. 1 out of 9 people innocent. I mean, it's fascinating. In aviation, we would never let people fly on airplanes if for every 9 planes that took off, 1 would crash. But somehow we can insulate ourselves from...
This is a really clever juxtaposition of highlighting why this error rate is unacceptable. You give people something that they can see and understand. Would you get on a plane if there was an 11% chance of it crashing? If you think about how many flights have you taken in your lifetime, gosh, I've probably taken 100 flights in my lifetime, or probably more than that. I'm dead by now, aren't I? If 1 out of every 9 of those flights was going to crash, I'm not going to survive that many crashes, am I? So this is a really clever way of bringing context to a number. Again, this is where talking about data and statistics, it's not that data and statistics are bad things to have. It's you've got to provide the visual and emotional context for what that statistic means. Because the human brain, it actually isn't that great at processing and understanding numbers. So you've got to put that number into a story, into an image that people can understand. So even when Bryan isn't telling stories, he is actually telling stories. Because you would look at this part of the section, this part of the speech, and go, well, this isn't a story. He's talking about data and statistics. But actually what he needs to do is he needs to tell a story about that statistic in order to help us to understand. We get this tiny little micro anecdote of us getting on a plane and what would happen if that plane had a 1 in 9 chance of crashing. That is actually a story that he's telling, even though it doesn't seem like a story. So this is really just highlighting how the bedrock of this entire speech is stories. Even when you think it isn't a story, it is still a story. Stories are underpinning everything that Bryan is doing well in this speech.
It's not our problem. It's not our burden. It's not our struggle.
Do you hear that? Our? When you're delivering a speech, you've got to get this balance between you, me, and we. You is the audience, and that's ultimately where the end point of your speech is. Your speech is for the audience. It's for them to learn something, to do something, to be something different. And to get there, you've got to get this balance of a little bit of what you do, some of your positioning as, well, you've got to get the audience to like you, they've got to respect you and see you as credible and an authority. So it's not that a speech should have none of you at all, because the audience do want to know, well, why should I listen to Bryan Stevenson on this topic instead of listening to David McRae on this topic? Bryan Stevenson is a far more credible person to listen to, but the audience have got to understand why he's a credible person to listen to. So he still has to put a little bit of that, here's about me. And then you've also got to build that bridge between you as the speaker, them as the audience. And that's where you establish the commonalities. That's the we. So this is the way that we see things. Or would we get onto a plane if it had a 1 in 9 chance of crashing? So you establish yourself as the credible authority that's liked, trusted, listened to. You then use commonality to build that bridge. This is the we, the us, or in this case, our. And then it's developing a focus on the audience. What can you do? What should you do? How can you think about this? What can you change or impact or improve? Getting this balance right in a speech is really important. And what we see now is Bryan is starting to delve into that commonality aspect, thinking about the we and the our, establishing that common bond to build that bridge to where he wants his audience to see things and what he wants them to do after the speech.
I was giving this lecture in Germany, some lectures in Germany about the death penalty. It was fascinating because one of the scholars stood up after the presentation and said, well, you know, it's deeply troubling to hear what you're talking about. I said, well, we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And of course, we can never have the death penalty in Germany. And the room got very quiet, and this woman said, there's no way with our history we can ever engage in the systematic killing of human beings. It would be unconscionable for us to, in an intentional, deliberate way, set about executing people. And I thought about that. What would it feel like to be living in a world where the nation state of Germany was executing people, especially if they were disproportionately Jewish? I couldn't bear it. It would be unconscionable. And yet in this country, in the states of the Old South, we execute people where you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get it if the defendant is black and the victim is white. In the very states where there are buried in the ground the bodies of people who were lynched, and yet there is this disconnect.
I know I played a long section there, but I think you just need to see that section in its entirety. When I'm doing TEDx masterclasses and workshops, when I'm coaching at TEDx events, and to us, even when I'm doing workshops separately with private clients or different organizations and companies, I'll often use this clip and I just use it to illustrate the power of story and analogy to make a point. Bryan could say this point differently. He could say, doesn't it feel a bit weird that we used to have slavery in the past and now we disproportionately kill African Americans in the criminal justice system? That's basically what he's trying to say here. But isn't it much more powerful when he builds up this narrative and this story, and he doesn't actually make that point explicitly till right at the end? The audience build up their own conclusion. As he starts to paint this alternative reality, the audience start to come to that uncomfortable conclusion by themselves, thinking about an alternative Germany with the death penalty, thinking about the disproportionate treatment of Jewish people in that hypothetical Germany. You start to get really uncomfortable thinking about that. And as soon as that uncomfortable emotion comes up, Bryan just then makes the short jump into, well, here's how that parallel universe is not far away at all. It's a really clever execution of how you get people to understand the point. He still makes the point at the end, but the point is so much more powerful because he's built it up with that story and then that analogy. And you notice the data and statistics still comes at the end, where you're 11 times more likely if the victim is white compared to the victim is black, 22 times more likely if the perpetrator. So he still comes in with those statistics right at the end. But now those statistics have a story behind them. And that's what makes statistics powerful. No statistic is powerful and impactful just delivered by itself. Statistics need the story behind them. And when you've got the story behind them, you almost don't need the statistic after that, because the story has done all the heavy lifting.
Are shadowed by suffering, abuse, degradation, martyrdom.
Do you see there's a little negative triad that comes here? Suffering, abuse, degradation. Put a bookmark in that. Let's watch what comes next.
Personalization. And for me, it becomes necessary to integrate the two. Because ultimately, we are talking about a need to be more hopeful, more committed, more dedicated to the basic challenge.
Now we see a positive triad coming here. Again, this is where we're seeing synergistic techniques coming in. Bryan Stevenson uses the rule of three. He talks about here's three bad things. And by listing it in a three, it hammers it home. The suffering, the abuse, the degradation. We start to get this more developed picture of what the bad side of the equation looks like. But then he juxtaposes it. Well, actually, here's a more positive direction that we're aiming to build into. So it's not employing techniques in isolation. It's understanding the holistic picture of what your speech looks like. In these analysis videos, I'm quite often breaking a speech down into the individual parts. I'm like, oh, here's some alliteration here, here's a joke here. And of course, you want to understand how these little parts work. But when it comes time to developing and creating your own speech, you can't make a speech through individual techniques. You've got to have it weave together, and you've got to understand how what you're doing throughout the speech builds into each other. How does it relate to each other? And you're seeing an example of that here, that Bryan is using these techniques to build up a bigger picture. He's painting this journey of this is how the situation and the problem looks like now, but this is what the journey to the solution can look like. Building this complete picture for the audience rather than these smaller pictures in isolation. That's what you need to be thinking about, or what we all need to be thinking about when we're doing speeches, is how do the different parts of your speeches build and develop together rather than just being, I'm going to tell this anecdote, move on to the next thing, put in this data and statistic, move on to the next thing, use this clever catchy metaphor here, move on to the next thing. It's not about individual bricks, it's about how the entire building looks.
Challenge injustice. We're trying to help people who've been wrongly convicted. We're trying to confront bias and discrimination in the administration of criminal justice. We're trying to end life without parole sentences for children. We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to reduce the prison population. We're trying to end mass incarceration. I gave her my whole rap, and when I...
Do you hear how the pace of Bryan's speech intensifies there? Now, throughout this speech, Bryan's got this nice, soft, mellifluous voice to listen to. It's very calm, very steady. What he understands at this point is he wants to inject some of that passion, some of that enthusiasm. And that passion and enthusiasm comes through that increasing of pace. And again, we're seeing here the subtleties. The subtleties are where the magic happens. Bryan doesn't speak a million miles an hour here, but you notice that he does speak noticeably faster. It's noticeably faster, but not ridiculously faster. When he wants to inject that energy into the speech, he's able to tap into that toolbox to be able to do it. Even though most of the time he has a default vocal range that isn't straying too far away, he understands, here's the little injections. Here's where I can dial up that meter a little bit more in order to achieve the desired effect.
I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Miss Carr leaned forward, she put her finger on my face and said, that's why you've got to be brave. And I actually believe that
what we see here, we get the mixture of techniques. We've got the two triads, tired, brave. This is where we understand the role of humor. Now, again, I mentioned Ken Robinson's talk earlier on. This is basically, that was his whole MO as a speaker, was get the audience to laugh so they understand the serious message behind it. Now, Bryan hasn't quite stepped that far into the mold of Ken Robinson, but we're certainly seeing emblematic aspects of that. When you get the audience to laugh at something, laughter heightens people's attention. It gets them to engage emotionally with what you're saying. When you get the audience to laugh, they listen afterwards. When you get them to laugh and they're listening, then you tell them the serious message. And we see that happen in this 15-second clip of you're going to be tired, 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 ha ha ha, build the attention, build the engagement, build the emotion. You've got to be brave, brave, brave. This is serious. This is real. It's going to be hard work. And you'll notice you feel the audience switch a little bit. They go, oh yeah, that was funny. Oh wait, I maybe shouldn't be laughing at this point. They connect with that second point emotionally because they were already emotionally activated and primed by the bit you got them to laugh at. Again, a really nice demonstration here of bringing different techniques together and understanding how different parts of your speech play off against each other. The parts of your speech don't work in isolation. They're all about how they build and connect to the other parts of your speech.
That in many parts of this country, and certainly in many parts of this globe, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I don't believe that. I actually think in too many places, the opposite of poverty is justice. And finally, I believe.
Again, we see a reframing of this issue, and it's actually a little bit of a callback to, do you remember the juxtaposition of we treat people better if they're rich and guilty than if they're poor and innocent? We get a little bit of a building on this idea of the opposite of poverty is not wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. It's reframing the arguments, reframing the issue, getting people to look at the issue in a different way of, oh, okay, if we are able to solve the problems of poverty, in many ways, we're able to address the problems of justice as well, and certainly the problems of injustice. Again, this is what great speakers and this is what great leaders do, is they understand, okay, a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, you can't just confront the problem head on in the same old way you've always done it. When you do that, you often create these divides. And God, I mean, in the era that we're living with, when everything is about polarization this day, isn't it? It's this side of the issue, this side of the issue. And a lot of the time, it seems that that polarization is unbridgeable, that you're basically just, you've got two different perspectives on an issue and you're never going to resolve it. Well, a way that you reduce the polarization is not to try to get to bridge people along that same chasm. Often that same chasm is big, it's dangerous, good luck trying to build a bridge over it. But if you try to make a bridge in a totally different area, completely different field, maybe that huge big ravine, if you go far enough up the water stream, well, maybe it's just a little gap like this. But you're only able to bridge the gap here by taking away the focus from let's try and get over this big chasm to let's try to move the perspective and move the approach to a completely different area. And then we might be able to see how we look at this problem differently and how we can actually relate to this problem and have a lot more agreement and understanding based on this issue. I hope that metaphor made sense. I just pulled that out of my pocket right here in the moment, but you get what I mean, okay? Leaders are able to reframe problems in a different way because when you look at something different, you're able to find different solutions.
You judge the character of a society, not by how they treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged, but by how they treat the poor, the condemned, the incarcerated. Because it's in...
You see it again, I'm not going to repeat the same issue twice, but we see this juxtaposition of triads. Not how we treat the rich, the privileged, and whatever the other one was. The rich, the privileged. Oh, you've seen the recording, you know what he said. It's how you treat the poor, the condemned, and the incarcerated. So again, the employment of different techniques and the merging of techniques here. Not the techniques in isolation. I think this is something that Bryan has really understood with his speech, is how to create contrast in his speech and how to get someone to understand one aspect of an issue by presenting a contrasting image of that issue.
Did I dream that crazy motion or did I actually write it? And to my horror, Not only had I written it, but I had sent it to court.
Do you see that little, it's almost like a little bit of a trademark that he's developed now, that little swallow and expression. Again, it's not overdone, but it's just this nice little development of that idea. It's matching your non-verbals with your verbals. So that swallow and that expression, it really highlights the horror and the shock of what Bryan realizes he's just done. It's all about the nuance and subtlety in your body language. It's these small gestures and small expressions that can often have the biggest impact on the audience.
That all of our survival is tied to the survival of everyone. That our visions of technology and design and entertainment and creativity have to be married with the visions of humanity, compassion, and justice. And more than anything,
I think this is an interesting point of the speech. A lot of people don't know what TED actually stands for. Technology, entertainment, and design. And I think there was this period in TED when TED reconstructed itself, refounded itself, when Chris Anderson did a lot of the driving behind what TED would grow into. Those were the roots of TED. And as TED grew and expanded, there was this always trying to link back to that core imaging and message and ethos of TED. And I don't think that that's really true now. I think people recognize that TED is just about, it's almost like the E just stands for education. It's let's educate people and let's talk about all of these varieties of different issues. And it's a platform to have these different conversations about different topics. But when we're watching this, so this speech was in 2012, I think we're still in that era of speakers feeling like they had to link back into that core identity of TED. And it's not that this is a bad thing at all. This is actually something to recognize. When you are speaking for an event or an organization, you've got to think about how your topic and your speech links in to that event and that organization. So although Bryan Stevenson here, he's focusing on these ideas of justice and compassion and humanity, he's saying, look, this isn't just me on my soapbox about these topics. This is how this topic actually links into what the rest of us are talking about at this event. How this links into what the host as an organization, as an event, what they are all about as well. So although I think this isn't something that we would, if Bryan Stevenson was doing this speech in this decade, 10 years later, you would see he wouldn't feel the need to do that. But I'm not pointing this out as a bad thing. This is actually a skill that we do want to understand as speakers, how what we're doing links into the wider context in which we're speaking. Not necessary if this was a TED Talk nowadays, but still a skill that we can learn from and employ in our speeches.
for those of you who share that, I've simply come to tell you to keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Thank you very much.
And there we see the longest standing ovation in TED history. We've got a punchy statement to finish here. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. And what I like about that, it uses some of the dialogue from an early character. So it's not something that I looked at in this analysis, but if you go and watch the full video, you'll see that the third and final anecdote of this speech is about Bryan Stevenson going into the courtroom. There's a janitor there, and that's what the janitor says to him. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. So he uses a line from before in the speech so the audience recognize it, they have this emotional connection to it, and he finishes on that punchy line. It's directive, it's action orientated. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, it's action. This is what we need to do as the audience. And really nice finish to be able to employ something that came in the speech before, make it action orientated, make it directive, and poof, that's what gets the audience out of their seats and delivering this long standing ovation. Would you like to make $1 million from your next speech? Now, I can't promise anything like that, but I think Bryan Stevenson's talk demonstrates what the ceiling of our speeches is. That if we get our speech right, if we connect with the audience in the right way, if we make a problem or an issue clear enough to them, you can galvanize them to action. And yes, we can put some numbers behind the impact of Bryan Stevenson's speech, but there's certainly much more impact of our speeches that don't necessarily have that cold, hard number that comes out at the end of it. If you would like a speech that has that level of impact on your audience, then you want to check out my TEDx Masterclass. So this is a recording of a workshop that I did at one of the TEDx events that I coach here in Scotland. And in this, we highlight what are the key foundations of a successful TED Talk. And actually, in this masterclass, I talk about the structure of a TED Talk. And that structure is pretty much based and inspired by the structure that Bryan Stevenson uses in this TED Talk, how he focuses on the power of story to bring an issue and a subject to life. I've made this recording of the masterclass totally free for you, so you can use it as an additional resource to learn more about your speeches, and in particular, if you want to do a TED speech going into the future. I've put the link to the course in the video description below. If you click through to that link, that'll give you a whole extra hours of training for your speeches and for your TED speeches, totally free as part of your ongoing education in this video series. Now, as great as Bryan Stevenson's talk was, there's always areas where we can improve and sharpen. Let's now look at how, if Bryan was to do this talk all over again, what could he look at improving and changing to make it even more impactful than it was when he delivered it?
Well, this is a really extraordinary honor for me. I spend most of
the moment that Bryan comes onto stage, we see he's fiddling with his button, and the first words out of his mouth are, "This is a great honor for me." Not the strongest of starts. You want to make sure that when you are coming up onto stage, you are physically ready to present. Make sure that whatever you need to do if your clothes are all done, that you've got your buttons the way you want them to, are you buttoned, are you unbuttoned, make sure your mic is connected properly, all that kind of stuff. You shouldn't be still working on that as you're coming up onto stage. And the first words are, "This is a great honor for me." That's not really capturing the audience about why they should listen. What's in it for them? Remember earlier on in the video, I was talking about the balance between you, me, and we? And I put it into that order quite specifically because what you need to demonstrate first with your speech is what's in it for you. What's in it for you as the audience to listen. And when the first statement is a me statement, an I statement, it's not capturing the audience and it's not encouraging them to listen further. So I think Bryan could have had a stronger, more composed start coming out the blocks.
And I mention that because I think identity is really important.
Here's one of my bugbears for usually men who are speaking, especially when you've got the whole suit and blazer deal, the hand in the pocket. The amount of men who speak with one hand that gets stuck in their pocket, it usually happens when you've got the suit kind of attire on. Get the hands out of the pockets. Your hands are a really important part of how you communicate your non-verbal communication. They're also a really key element of trust. In particular, when you show open palms to someone, it's a very placating gender, goodness me, I'm getting mixed up here. It's a very placating gesture of, hey, look, I'm not a threat to you, you can trust me, I'm open. When your hand's in your pocket, it's obscured, it's hidden. You've got that whole Gollum, what has it got in its pockets, precious? This is in the first 60 seconds of the speech. Those first 60 seconds are such an important part of building that rapport and trust and relatability of the audience. And when you've got this closed off, when you've got this secret hand in the pocket, it's not doing the work of helping you to build that relationship in the beginning. So this is a bad habit that I noticed mainly in men speakers, usually just because of the type of attire that's generally worn by men versus women speakers on stage. But I do see it in women as well. Less often because women's clothes, as the meme goes, don't have pockets in them. So I do see this more from male speakers. But I see this for anyone who does have pockets. Often one or both hands get stuck in them. Remember the Lord of the Rings, keep your hands out your pockets. Gollum doesn't like it.
Matriarch, and that matriarch was my grandmother. She was tough, she was strong, she was powerful.
Tough, strong, powerful. Now here's a rule of three, and I've been waxing lyrical about the rules of three leading up until this point. But here we actually see one of the first, and might actually be the first rule of three in this speech. And I actually don't think this is a good rule of three. Tough, strong, powerful. Those are synonyms of each other. They aren't three different things that add to building up this character. That's like me saying that building is huge, big, and monstrous. They all mean the same stuff, don't they? So this rule of three, he said three words there, but they aren't actually adding any meaning. They aren't building up the character of the grandmother. So this particular rule of three, and it's a shame because I think pretty much every other rule of three that Bryan uses in this speech is very clever and well executed. But this one, I think, just listing three synonyms isn't doing enough to build up the character of his grandmother.
She was the end of every argument in our family. She was the beginning of a lot of arguments in our family.
So what we see here next, I think this is a much better construction of the character of his grandmother. When he says that she was strong, tough, and powerful, I'm like, okay, one of those words is giving me an idea. But when we say that she was the end of every argument, okay, well now I get a much clearer idea of how sort of dominant she is, how respected she is, maybe a little how feared that she is. And then we also get, she was the beginning of a lot of arguments as well. Well, now we hear that laugh from the audience. So now you've created this emotional response to the grandmother. The audience are engaged a lot more. So I think this characterization of his grandma was a lot better. So I would have just scrapped that rule of three, just listing the three synonyms. Just go to this. Those two lines, give me an idea. When he says these two lines, I'm not thinking that his grandmother is weak, feeble, and meek. You see, just this description, I'm already seeing that she is strong, tough, powerful. I'm getting that association through that description. So I would have cut out that rule of three, go to this description. It's a much better way to bring the character of his grandmother to life.
And my grandmother was tough, but she was also loving. When I would see her as a little boy, she'd come up to me and she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tight I could barely breathe. And then
I want that gesture to be bigger. Do you hug people like this? You don't, do you? You hug people like this. So I want to see a big hug from the grandmother. When Bryan Stevenson does this, like, it actually looks a bit more like choking than hugging. And choking obviously is not a loving gesture. So when he goes like this, it's not just a small gesture, but it actually doesn't look like what he's meaning it to. It's creating a negative connotation because it looks more like holding tightly, choking. We want to see this big hug. We want to see how big his grandmother's love is. And yes, then we can get that tightness. But when we get the tightness here, it's loving. When we get the tightness here, it looks a little different and a bit more violent.
And she took me by the hand and she said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk." And I remember this just like it happened yesterday. I never will forget it. She took me out back and she said, "Bryan, I'm going to tell you something, but you don't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "Now you make sure you don't do that." I said, "Sure." Then she sat me down and she looked at...
Do you hear that? She said, I said, she said, I said. It's a little bit clunky, isn't it? I think Bryan can make this part of the story more immersive by acting out the dialogue rather than reporting the dialogue. Do you see how he stands there and he is in exactly the same place for his grandmother is speaking and he's speaking. "I'm going to tell you something, Bryan. Now you don't tell anyone." "Okay, grandmother. Well, this is what I'm going to tell you." It's all here. And so we don't really get this picture and vision of our mind of little Bryan looking up to his dominant matriarchal grandmother, the one who's the end and the start of all the arguments, the character that he's built up here before. I would have him acting out the dialogue here and embodying the characters a little bit. So embodying more of what he was like as a younger child, embodying how he remembers his grandmother. Now, Bryan, I'm going to tell you something. You don't tell anyone about it. Oh, okay, grandmother, what is it? Now, you promised not to tell anyone. So you start to get the voice, you start to get the characterization. He can have the mannerisms of his grandmother, he can have the mannerisms of himself. And what that is doing is it's pulling people into the story. It's the difference between telling someone what happened and showing them what happened. When he's reporting the speech, he's telling the audience, grandmother said this, I said this, she said this, I said this. Not only is it a little bit clunky to go back and forth like that, but it's not activating the audience's imagination. They aren't seeing the conversation. They aren't potentially seeing when they had a similar conversation with an older relative in their life, when they maybe had a similar conversation with their grandmother that looked and sounded very similar. Therefore, there is a missed opportunity for relatability here, for emotional connection to this story. Because when we see Bryan and his grandmother speaking in this way, we might be able to see ourselves in this story. And that's the power of a story. That's why we tell stories as speakers. We tell stories as speakers because we want the audience to see themselves in the story. Because if the audience see themselves in the story, they then see themselves as being part of the different thinking, the different action, the different identity that you lead them to later on in the speech. So I think this moment could be a lot more powerful and much less clunky if Bryan just takes that moment to act out the dialogue a little bit more. Now, we're not looking for Shakespearean acting here, but just a little bit of differentiation to bring this scene to life.
I grew up in the country in the rural South, and I have a brother a year older than me and a sister a year younger. When I was about 14 or 15, one day my brother came home and he...
Okay, did you see that again? We had the double hands in the pockets. And this isn't to belabor the same point. I want to demonstrate why it's not just about don't put your hands in your pockets for pocket's sake. He's talking there about where he grew up and his siblings. And can you imagine just how much more visual and evocative that would be if he was using his gestures to bring this scene to life? So he's talking about, I grew up in the South and I had a brother and a sister, and what we would do. He's then starting to paint the scene and paint the vision. This is coming up to the stage where they all go out and he gets offered beer, and we have the big punchline about, oh, you didn't listen to what Mama said, did you? He could be building the momentum, going into the climax of that scene, going into that first punchline, ultimately going into that first message that he wants to deliver. So this isn't just about, oh, I'm picking out about hands and pockets because I'm anal or I'm nitpicky. It's saying, no, think about what the alternative is. Think about what the alternative looks like and how that could be feeding into the rest of the speech and later parts of the speech. We've talked so much in this analysis video about how Bryan has done that so well, about seeing, okay, this isn't just an individual part of the speech, this is how this links into what I'm doing in the next part of the speech, or what I might be doing a long way later down the line in this particular speech. So I think this was just an example of where he didn't quite get that execution right. And that's all my thoughts on what Bryan could do to sharpen up this speech. Really kind of front-loaded in this speech. I think Bryan's start, there were aspects of it being slow, not quite having the execution and sharpness that I'd be looking for, and certainly not the execution and sharpness that we see elsewhere in the speech. But what I do think this demonstrates is that if you don't have a great start in a speech, it doesn't mean that the speech is ruined. Longest standing ovation in TED history, $1 million of donations secured for his nonprofit. Even though I picked out many things in the start where I said, well, actually, that's not really having the desired effect, or it's not having the same effect that it could do. So the lesson I think we can learn from this speech, number one, is about the power of story to bring a message to life. What we're seeing from the elements of improvements and adjustments here is, of course, he would have done a better job engaging the audience more from the beginning, grabbing their attention from the beginning. Maybe that standing ovation is longer. Maybe those donations are more if he achieves that at the beginning. But it also means if a start of your speech doesn't quite go to plan, it doesn't have the execution, it doesn't have the sharpness, it doesn't have the response you're looking for, it doesn't mean the rest of the speech is a wipeout. You can still build that momentum going forward, still have that desired outcome and impact at the end, even if it takes a little bit more work and a little bit more crafting of the speech to get you to that point at the end. This is an iconic and certainly an impactful TED Talk. And I think it's really nice to have a TED Talk where you can point to some of those cold, hard numbers, because it demonstrates the impact and value of these techniques and of these principles that we're talking about. Because I can stand up here and wax lyrical and say, oh, public speaking is all about telling stories, and if you tell good stories, you'll have a good speech. That's easy to say, and in certain aspects, it's easy to listen to, but I think this speech embodies that lesson, embodies that message, embodies what you can do as a speaker with your speeches.